There's a big misunderstanding that LLCs protect you from all liability. Today, by the end of this video, we're going to talk about that so that you know, is that true or is that not true? Welcome back. I'm Pantea Fizuni with Palm Desert Law Group. So what does an LLC stand for? LLC stands for a limited liability company. So what does that really mean? Well, an LLC is sort of like a hybrid between a sole proprietorship as well as a corporation. And you kind of get the best of both worlds. So with an LLC, you get a lot of protections that we think of the corporations typically have, the main one being protection of liability protection, separating business assets from personal assets, but it's not as difficult or as complicated as a corporation in order to maintain. So when I started the video, I mentioned that there are some misunderstandings about what the liability protections are for an LLC. So let's talk about that. So when you have an LLC, you are protecting some of your assets from some of your other assets. Basically, what you have invested in the company is all of the assets that potential creditors could end up going after. So if you're a sole proprietor, for example, there is no separation between you and your business. When you're an LLC, there is some separation between you and your business, but it's not complete and absolute. So I like to think about it as buckets. When you have an LLC, you are separating your business assets into one bucket and your personal assets into another bucket. So that, let's say you have a shoe company and you have all of your product, they're all shoes, you have a couple of stores that you rent out and maybe a couple of delivery vehicles. If something happens related to that business, let's say your driver gets into a car accident and causes damage, the extent of what a creditor or could go after would have to do with that business. They wouldn't be able to go after your personal home. They might be able to go after a vehicle or two, maybe some inventory, but your personal assets would be completely protected. All right, so if you end up in court and you have some creditors coming after you, how is the court supposed to know what assets are your business assets, which aren't protected, which assets are your personal assets that are protected? Well, it really comes down to title. So when you have a separate business, you want to make sure, and you have particular in LLC, you have to have separate business bank accounts. You need to make sure that you're paying everything for the business through those separate bank accounts, not through your personal accounts. When you pay yourself, you want to make sure you're paying yourself from the LLC, putting your money into your personal bank accounts. When you purchase things for the business, if you purchase a vehicle for the business, if you enter into a lease for the business, if you buy property for the business, it's important to make sure that you are doing so through the business, using the business funds. And whenever you sign anything, making sure that you sign not personally, but as representative of the LLC. That's really, really, really important. And then of course, it's important to, when you buy your personal assets, make sure you're not using business assets, business funds to purchase those personal assets, because if you do, then there is that assumption that it belongs to the business rather than to you personally. And you want to make sure that you keep your personal assets separate completely. Having those separate bank accounts, having separate, let's say, investment accounts, so on and so forth. If you have any questions, if you need help setting up your LLC, please feel free to reach out to me. My name is Pantea Fizuni. My information should be on the screen, and I look forward to talking to you and seeing how I can help you start and grow your LLC. So there are definitely some exceptions to the liability protections that you get from an LLC. Now, I want to back up a little bit and talk about why it is that the law actually gives you that liability protection. When you set up a separate entity like a corporation or like an LLC, there's a presumption in the law that that business, that LLC, is a separate entity from you. Obviously, it's not living and breathing, but as far as the law views it, it's a separate living, breathing entity, completely separate from you. The way that you show that, there's a few things. One, you have to actually form it properly according to your state's laws. There are particular forms that you need to fill out. There's particular things that you need to do. Two, you need to make sure that all of the bank accounts are separate, which we've already kind of talked about a little bit. Third, you want to make sure that your LLC is properly funded. That means that for whatever your business is, and it will be different for various businesses, you want to make sure that the LLC has enough funds to keep itself going. So if you have, let's say, a small personal service industry, let's say you are a hairdresser and you rent out a space, you rent out a chair in a salon, well, the capitalization that you need is going to be very small relatively compared to, let's say, that shoe company that we were talking about. The shoe company has multiple retail locations, it has multiple staff, it has multiple product lines and delivery and online capabilities. It's going to need a whole lot more money in the bank account at the very beginning to be able to make sure that it can pay all of its bills, pay all of its liabilities. So it's really important to make sure that your LLC is properly funded. And of course, like I said, that's something that is going to depend, the amount is going to depend on the type of business and the scope of the business that you're particularly in. There's one other thing, which is maintaining corporate formalities. That's the legalese way of saying it, but in an easier way to say it, it's basically making sure that you're keeping track of what the business is doing. Now, corporations have strict guidelines. They have to meet annually. The board of directors, typically the shareholders have to meet annually. They have to discuss it. They have to write out those meeting minutes. LLCs aren't that strict. They don't have to keep the record keeping as strictly the way that corporations do. However, it's always a good idea to do that so that if you do end up in court in conflict over your LLC, another way to show that it is completely separate from you is to show that you do have been meeting, you are having those meeting minutes, you are treating it completely as a separate entity. So now to go back and actually answer the question about limitations to that liability, as long as you are doing those three things, as well as that optional fourth, you're gonna have that protection. The law is going to view your business as your LLC as a separate legal entity from you. But if you don't do that, you're not gonna have that liability protection. So if you are using the corporate, the LLC bank accounts to pay your personal bills, the court's not going to find that it's a separate business and it's not going to give you that liability protection. If you start a big company and you've only got about $10,000 in the bank when really you need $500,000 in the bank at the beginning to make sure it's a viable business, the court is not going to view that as a separate entity. You're not going to have that liability protection. If you do not follow the rules and do not actually set up your LLC property, or if you don't pay the required annual taxes every year, once again, the court's not going to view that as a viable separate business. You're not going to have that liability protection. So it's very, very, very important to follow all of those things to make sure you do have that protection for your separate assets. One other thing, lots of entrepreneurs I know don't have just one business, they'll have 2, 3, 4, sometimes more businesses. It's also very key that you don't mix money from the different businesses. So business A needs to pay for all of its own bills. It can't have business B or business C paying for it, because if they do and something comes up in business B or C or A, they can go after those other multiple businesses in addition to your own personal assets. So it's really important that if you have that LLC, you treat it as a separate entity and you do it right from the beginning. Now, for those LLC owners, it's also really vital that you have the right and the proper business insurance in place. This can definitely be one of those tricky areas, as there's so many different types of insurances, and just having one is probably not going to be enough. Types of business insurance that most businesses need include business liability insurance. So if someone comes into your business and has an accident, you want to make sure that there's insurance to cover that. You want to make sure that if you have any employees, there's workers' compensation insurance. A lot of times you're going to want to have directors and officers liability insurance, so that if the directors and the officers take an action and it may not have been the right action, there's insurance to cover that. Something else that's really important, especially for the major players, the founders, is key man insurance, especially if you have partners and other people who rely on you in that business, to make sure that if, heaven forbid, something happens to you, the insurance policy will pay out so that everyone else will be able to keep that business going, even if you aren't there yourself. There's also a whole bunch of other types of insurance, too many to go through, but this is where a good business attorney is going to be key, looking at all of your insurance foundations, as well as your legal, your tax, and your financial basis and foundations, to make sure that they're right where they need to be. So we started off talking about whether a LLC, a limited liability company, would protect all of your assets no matter what, under any circumstances. And so throughout the course of the video, we've talked about that. Bet you probably thought it was going to be a yes or no question, but as you saw, there's a lot of considerations that go into that. If you have any questions, if you need help setting up your LLC, please feel free to reach out to me. My name is Pantea Fizuni. My information should be on the screen, and I look forward to talking to you and seeing how I can help you start and grow your LLC.